Hey, I want to show you something before I start reading the rest of chapter 2 tonight. As you can see, I took a drive out to Petroleum Center. In our last video, we read a little bit from the Great Oildorado in chapter 1 and 2. They introduced George Bissell, who was part of the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company, hired a chemist to study the oil, and sent Colonel Drake to Titusville to drill for it. He moved to Franklin, Pennsylvania, to devote all his attention on his new oil interest. He opened his own bank, the George H. Bissell and Company, in Oil City, and also a branch at Petroleum Center. And I'm walking now at that location. If you look closely, you can still see some of the foundation. Of course, not so much in the snow, but in the summertime, you can still see it. And if it wasn't for the foundation, you wouldn't know it even existed. It's as you can see, a ghost town. And this is a picture of how it looked then. Just a few feet from here is Oil Creek, the waterway that made millionaires. All right, when we left off, Colonel Drake was getting ready to leave for Titusville. On April 2nd, 1858, he wrote Dr. Brewer a letter letting him know that he would be arriving in the area around the 13th after he stopped and visited his father in Vermont. Okay, let's begin. Round-cheeked, beaming Billy Robinson, the proprietor of the American Hotel in the snug little valley village of Titusville, was rather impressed when large envelopes arrived on 3 successive days addressed to Colonel Edwin Drake, who was due to arrive with his family that week. Townsend pulled the title out of his hat to provide an air of worth to his new agent. He may even provided the tall silk hat that the colonel wore as further window dressing, but the quiet dignity and honesty were all Drake's own. By the time that the villagers discovered the title was phony, they respected the man enough to go right on using it. Titusville, which is just over the border from Venango in Crawford County, had been founded in 1790 by Jonathan Titus, a civil engineer who had worked on surveys for the Holland Land Company and had spotted the lovely 3-mile-long valley lying between the hills, and he took a piece for a farm. Of the 300 people living there when Drake came, most of them were German, English, or North Irish immigrants. They were cautious, thrifty, and stubborn, and they paid grudging tribute to Drake's own stubbornness in sticking to his project that next grueling year, even if they thought the idea of boring for oil was just plumb crazy. At husking bees and church socials, the word went around that the colonel was a nice, hard-working gentleman, and it was just too bad that he'd been sucked in by some fancy stock company to come here and do a fool's errand. The poor man didn't look fit, and he was bad color and spindly. The meals at the American Hotel, where Drake paid $6.50 a week to room and board for himself, wife, and daughter, were generously designed to fatten almost anybody. Smoked pork and johnny cake, mutton and mashed turnips, and pie 3 times a day. On the wide, shady front porch, wicker rockers creaked behind broad white pillars, while the guests exchanged stories. The visiting lumberman always called the American Hotel the Tavern. The proprietor, Billy Robinson, was a hearty host who would referee the young mill hands' impromptu wrestling matches on his taproom floor, or preside over a round of tall tales. There was one other hotel in town, the Eagle, a general store, and a grist mill. The only other store was Peter Wilson's. He was a dealer in drugs, medicines, chemicals, paints, oil, and varnishes, pure wines and liquors, all for medicinal use. The main street was a stretch of sticky yaller clay. If you saw my Wizard of Oz video, you know that I referred to the yellow dirt or the yellow clay that was found everywhere in the area. Drake soon adopted the natives' clumping high boots, but the rest of him looked foreign. He dressed in the somber black of a deacon, and his long, thin legs and the overcoat that reached almost to the ground made him look much taller than his 5 feet 9.5 inches. His beard was silky and dark, and he had a thin face, and it was very long and looked wilted by suffering, and his enormous, deep-socketed black eyes gave him an ascetic look. But the men soon discovered that Drake could tell a good story, and he enjoyed a nip of whiskey and a skinny long Pittsburgh stogie when they sat around the fat-bellied coal stove in Fletcher's general store. Drake had a New England twangy humor and a deliberate way of speech. He was very proud of an ancestor of the Revolutionary War fame whose sword that he had inherited, but his own life had had more the scope of a paring knife. He'd gone to public school in Castleton, Vermont, worked on his uncle's farm. He'd been a hotel clerk and a clerk in a dry goods store. He was an express agent and then the conductor of the New Haven Railroad at $75 a month. Even though it was the three forces of Dr. Brewer, George Bissell, and Townsend who propelled Drake into the starting position, it was Drake who had the deep dog drive and the staying power. Even though he thought the oil spring on the small, barren, artificial island that was created by the mill flow was a rusty, disgusting looking pool, he insisted later that neither Bissell nor anyone else had told him how to get petroleum in quantities out of the ground, and that he had to try whatever came to mind. Hiring local workmen to dig around the seepage seemed like a logical start. But even that wasn't simple. He could get plenty of men, but a mill hand once remembered Drake saying, "You don't mean to say that I can't even buy picks and shovels in this town?" The storekeeper, Fletcher, had the answer to this and a dozen other dilemmas. He was a kind, sensible man, cheerful and warm, and helpful in the best Cracker Barrel tradition. And even if he didn't carry picks and shovels, he was quick to offer the loan of his horse so that Drake could ride off and buy from Fletcher's nearest rival in Hidetown. Drake got a pick there in the log cabin store kept by Charles Hyde, but he had to go to Sam Brown's in Pleasantville for spikes, and on to John Mitchell's in Enterprise for a chain. And he had to send to Erie, about 45 miles away, to get 2 shovels. All that summer he kept borrowing Fletcher's handsome bay horse and rig to ride off in all directions, assembling tools and machinery. He made long 2-day trips by stagecoach to Erie or Pittsburgh, and to Tarentum, where he consulted the owners of the salt wells and hired a driller who promised to arrive in July, but he never turned up. Drake had told the man sternly that he would receive only board and tobacco, but no cash, until he drilled a hole 1,000 feet down. Now, no salt well had ever been dug anywhere near that deep, and certainly never under such Spartan conditions. And this probably clinched that driller's suspicion that Drake may have been crazy. So he told his friends, "I promised to work for the lunatic just to shut him up and get rid of him." A second driller had good intentions, but itchy feet. Drake traced him to Pittsburgh and learned that he had headed west. He did have a workman that he hired at $1 a day who dug trenches, and then finally a hole. But Drake wrote to the directors of his company and said, "In sinking our well last week, we struck a large vein of oil, but the same thrust of the spade opened a vein of water that drove the men out of the well, and I shall not try to dig by hand any more, as I am satisfied that drilling is the cheapest. I have contracted for an engine to be ready for drilling by the 1st of September. The engine will cost $500 in Erie, which is about $100 less than the same or one like it would cost on the East. Now, I think you had better make a loan of 1,000 and place it in the bank there, when I can get to as I need to it. And I assure you, there is no risk whatsoever, for I have gotten as far with $500 as any company with 5,000. Money is very scarce here. The lumbermen could not sell their lumber for cash this summer, and the people all depend on the lumber trade, so money is tight. The men at the old lumber company are beginning to think that they did not retain the best of the property when they sold out the oil springs. Old Mr. Brewer is here now and says he's sorry they sold that piece of land or gave up that lease. But let them whine, he said. Ebenezer Brewer's partner wasn't a whiner. He was more of a shouter. Jonathan Watson was a bluff, rough lumberman with a craggy, big-nosed face and a voice fit for yelling timber. He took Drake's specifications for timber for the engine house, and he told his head sawyer, "He says it's for a derrick, and he's going to drill a hole through the rock and find a big body of oil, even if it takes a year. I have no faith in this project myself," he said. Drake entered the Brewer-Watson bill for $36 on his expense sheet, along with poor tax of 16 cents, a tinker's bill for $1.24, a trip to Erie for a pump for $6.63, and the carpenter at the engine house charged him $8, and Little Hershey and Company charged $100 for their engine. The $100 was a down payment to the Erie firm for the 6-horsepower engine and a stationary boiler recommended by saltmen, a long john, the kind used on steamboats. Even when all the machinery finally arrived, nobody around there knew how to operate the new gadgets. But Drake was anxious and hopeful as a child who has written to Santa Claus for a new toy. He had been promised still another driller, due in September, and waiting that great day, he told cheerful jokes on himself about his Drake's folly and quoted a farmer who remarked that Drake could always use his oil for syrup on buckwheat cakes. When the fall arrived and the bonfires sent up their nostalgic aroma, Drake told Fletcher one night about a dream that he once had as a child when he was living on his father's farm in Vermont. He dreamed that he set fire to a pile of stubble and it got out of control and spread. He woke from the nightmare screaming, and his mother soothed him by saying, "Why, that just means someday you'll set the world on fire." The nights were already closing in, and while Drake waited, the villagers went about their business and their pleasures. At apple-paring bees in the big, shabby farmhouse kitchens, the young men sat beside their best girls, and they used their pocket knives to pare and quarter the tart, rosy apples, while the girls strung the quarters together like yard-long necklaces and draped them around the fireplace to dry. It was mid-November when Drake finally realized that the third driller wasn't coming. He wrote his company director sadly and told them that he'd have to give up until this spring. With his engine sitting mute and swaddled inside its new home, Drake reported, "I sat myself down very uneasy to wait for spring. I never saw such a winter as they have in that part of Pennsylvania." His neuralgia was bad, and his constant worries about money enough to finish the project were real. By the time another April Fool's Day had come, it was technically the end of his contract. Drake informed the Seneca Oil Company that at last he had a lead on a dependable man, a blacksmith, who had often made tools and lent them to the salt well owners. But the directors no longer cared. Why should they pour more good money down the hole? Townsend gave Drake a few small token loans before he finally urged him give up the whole scheme and come home. Drake was the only man who showed any passion and faith for the project. In his mind, he had to finish the well. The villagers later said that Drake's sweet-faced wife was the good angel during those close to starving times, and that she kept the hope in his pain-racked body. But it was the people of Titusville who gave practical comfort. Even if they couldn't believe in the wild and woolly venture, they had come to have a rather affection for Drake. Jonah Watson looked sheepish once when a mill hand saw him give Drake a credit slip for the grist mill to get 100-pound bag of flour for his family. The lumberman said anybody who has the nerve to go ahead under these circumstances deserves some help. His friend Fletcher risked a good bit more. He let Drake run up a bill of over $300 at his store, and he went on believing that his friend would succeed, but he was puzzled as to what on earth anybody would do with the oil if he ever found it. In spite of that, the druggist Peter Wilson, Drake's only close friend, co-signed a personal loan for Drake of $500 at the Meadville Bank that summer. This time, Drake took no chances on losing his driller en route. He sent a local teamster to go fetch blacksmith William Smith and his 15-year-old son Sammy from Tarentum. Now, Smith agreed to work for $2.50 a day, with his son's services thrown in. And Drake also arranged with Smith to make a complete set of drilling tools at a total cost of $76.50. They weighed over 100 pounds. They were packed into the wagon, along with Smith's pretty oldest daughter, Margaret, who was wearing a new brown calico dress and a very uneasy look. She had promised to come and cook for her father and brother and to keep house in the new shanty, but her mother, who had to stay home with the youngest children, was worried of what could happen up there in the backwoods. On the spring May day, the wagon pulled up before the Drakes' little rented house. They had long since moved out of the hotel, and Drake was actually too ill to take Smith to the well, but he sat up in bed and talked feverishly about the project. Later, Drake was known to say, "I could not have suited myself better if I could have a man made to order." They must have been a strange twosome. Now, Smith was called Uncle Billy, and he was short and hefty, kind of a man that would have posed for Longfellow under a spreading chestnut fir. Whether or not he really believed in the project at first, he soon felt a protective devotion for it. He was offered a smithy job in Franklin at $4 a day. He told his son, "I can't quit Drake now." The derrick went up one afternoon in early June, and all the men at the upper mill, a few hundred feet away, came down with their pike poles to help raise the pine timber rigging, and they acted as if they were all having a holiday. Students from the nearby one-room schoolhouse wandered past, and two 12-year-olds stayed to join the fun. At least a dozen townspeople were there, including Fletcher. Dr. Brewer handed out cigars to the spectators, having a good time, saying, "Have one on me. They didn't cost me a cent. I traded oil stock for them." Inside the 12-foot square base of the derrick, there was a walking beam, and it was propelled by engine like a giant jerky grasshopper, sending the drilling tools down and up. But the soft earth kept caving in. Drake was watching and got one brilliant idea that even historians can't take away from him. He went off to Erie again, and he got a 50-foot piece of cast iron pipe, and it was in sections, and he had the jointed pipe driven down through the sand and the clay until it hit rock at 32 feet. Then the drilling went on steadily, 3 feet a day. On the sunny afternoon of August 27th, at 69 feet down, the drill suddenly stopped, 6 inches into a crevice. Uncle Billy fished it out, wiped it off, and stopped drilling for the day. Now, by then, the big, solid blacksmith turned driller had a touch of the fever that keeps a man restless. Monday seemed like a long way off. By Sunday, Smith was back at the well, peering down the pipe, wondering if he really saw something glistening on the surface below. He grabbed a leftover pipe and plugged it like a dipper, and he thrust it down on a stick, and it came up filled with oil to the brim. A wild shout brought several mill hands running. Young Sammy shot off to town, making a record run in bare feet to notify Colonel Drake. It's at this point that the author of this book found Drake most irritating. What kind of hero is this, who not only isn't on hand to witness the famous strike, but doesn't even bother coming down to take a look until the next day? The whole village was buzzing. Even townsmen who still couldn't imagine what in tarnation might come of the find. They were eager to see it. A Franklin man who arrived there the next day joined the crowds, and they were streaming in on every road, in wagons, on horseback, or on foot. They were all there to see the flowing dark grease flowing from the earth with a heavy white froth. By then, the few pine barrels that Drake had provided were already full. Drake, who seemed to be the calmest man around, took Margaret Smith's washtub from the engine house and commandeered a whiskey barrel to fill with oil. In New York, George Bissell received the word about the new contraption, and the telegraph from Dr. Brewer said he was regretting trading stock for cigars. He was ready to buy it all back. 4 days later, Bissell was on a train to Titusville to grab his leases and claim his victory. One of the deals he tried to make was in the fall when he tried to lease the Story Farm on Lower Oil Creek. He persuaded the owner all right, but the farmer's dumpy little wife was stubborn. Perhaps she'd caught some submersive shift in the wind that was generated by Susan Anthony, Lucy Stone, and those other women rights advocates. Whatever her reason, she wasn't giving in, and even Bissell's hair-tossing eloquence couldn't budge her. She said she'd think it over, but as co-owner, she wouldn't sign any lease. "Come back tomorrow," she said. And Bissell went back, but a wily group from Pittsburgh beat him there. The agent for the Pittsburgh group offered the Storys $40,000. When Mrs. Story refused to sign, he won her over, lock, stock, and barrel, by writing into the contract, and for the missus, one new silk dress. She then signed. The stockholders of that Pittsburgh company included a young steel man by the name of Andrew Carnegie, and he made a pretty packet out of that deal. He made enough to pay for Mrs. Story's silk dress, plus Carnegie's new steel mill, and whatever else their hearts desired. And even before the Pittsburghers sent their silk-tongued agent, the local boys were on to a good thing, and fast. They had all known of Silliman's report on the value of oil, but now suddenly it hit them head on. If sickly Drake could drill a well that produced enough to make real money, then so could they. At 7:30 a.m. that morning, after Uncle Billy hauled up that first big dipper full of oil, Jonah Watson rode up to the mill on horseback, and he called his head sawyer, William Kirkpatrick, outside. Of course, this was the same Sawyer that he had already said before, "I don't have any faith in Drake's project myself." And now he had to explain with a straight face that there was some urgent business had come up, and he had to leave immediately. He stated he would be gone for a few days, and could Kirkpatrick look after things. And then he went galloping off like Paul Revere, but not to warn anybody, but to buy and lease their land before they even knew what hit them. Now the head sawyer, looking around and watching the rear end of his employer's horse, he called the tail sawyer, and in a loud voice he called over to James Starr and said, "Hey, look after the mill." And he leaped on his horse and went off to get 2 leases of his own by sundown. The tail sawyer, James Starr, went back into the mill and cheerfully oiled the circular saw. Now he owned 200 acres on the creek, and it was too poor for farming, and that's why he had taken the job at the mill to help eke out some cash. Within 3 years, he would eke out some cash all right, to the tune of $2 million. from leases and outright sales of his land, and the most conservative estimate, he earned another million in royalties. When he took his daughter to a fancy finishing school to enroll her, the head mistress snobbishly said, "I'm afraid your girl doesn't have the capacity." James Starr pulled out a roll of bills as thick as his neck and roared, "Then buy her some." If Jonah Watson had stayed at the mill that first Mad Monday and made a friendly deal with his tail sawyer, he might have done even better. But he had his eye on Ham McClintock's farm, about 12 miles down Oil Creek. The oil springs were even larger on that farm. Ham McClintock had often collected oil from the seepage for medicine, and the only people who really got excited over it were scholars like Timothy Alden, who was the president of Allegheny College in Meadville. He delivered a paper in 1820 entitled Antiquities and Curiosities of Western Pennsylvania, in which he marveled over the old oil pits around McClintock's spring, cribbed with logs and bordered by mounds of the earth removed, in which grew trees hundreds of years old. Alden concluded that they must have been dug before the French and even before the Indians, perhaps even by the ancient mound builders. He also suggested by extending the operation this oil might be collected so as to become a profitable article of commerce. Now, Jonah Watson, he didn't give a hoot about the cribbed old pits, but now he too thought oil might be a profitable article of commerce. And before 9 o'clock a.m., he was already hitching his lathered horse by McClintock's barn and urging the owner to lay down his haying pitchfork and listen. Within an hour, the lumberman had a lease on 300 acres of land, also agreeing to give McClintock a 12th royalty of whatever was dug up, such as salt marsh and other minerals and even oil. All that day, as Watson went on leasing land clear to the mouth of the creek, he sprinkled mentions of salt to his tame prey. By the time he and his horse limped home, he had laid the groundwork for becoming the world's first oil millionaire, in a mansion with carved wooden moose heads, a little garden fish pond 190 feet long, and 12 gardeners. With booming good humor, Watson made several attempts to initiate Drake into his jolly sport of making a fortune, but Drake and money were forever at odds. Even though he brought on the deluge, he simply stepped aside and let it flow past. Now, he did spend a little bit of money, and he bought a pair of loud check pantaloons and a horse from a hard-up new country doctor, Dr. Albert Egbert, who was scratching around desperately for $200 to pay down on a farm that eventually turned out to be the most fabulous producer of the lot. At least Drake had the horse, and he didn't neglect company business. Drake arranged with Sam Kerr to buy the well's first shipment of oil at 60 cents a gallon, and then he took a day off and went fishing. One of his best stories that fall was about the Crawford County preacher who cornered Drake on the street in Titusville and told him to stop taking oil out of the ground. "Don't you know," he said, "that you are interfering with the Almighty Creator of the universe? He put that oil in the bowels of the earth to heat the fires of hell. Would you thwart the Almighty and let sinners go unpunished?" I'm sure the preacher was shocked, for within the next few years, it was golden with sinners in the early days on Oil Creek. And that's the end of Chapter 2. I'll see you next Sunday when we read the Boomer Brigade in Chapter 3. As always, thanks for listening.